The thunderous hoofbeats echoed across the plains as Grace Newman watched helplessly from the porch of her family's homestead. The dust still settling where moments before her younger sister, Sarah, had been dragged away screaming. Grace's knuckles turned white as she gripped the porch railing, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the Blackwell Gang had disappeared with the only family she had left in this world. Montana Territory, 1876. The Newman sisters had carved out a modest life for themselves after their parents' passing 2 winters ago. At 22, Grace had become both mother and father to 18-year-old Sarah, working their small farm with determination that impressed even the hardened settlers of White Rock Valley. But the Blackwell Gang cared nothing for determination or family bonds, only that the Newman land sat on a prime spot along Rattlesnake Creek, and rumor had it there might be gold in those hills. Grace rushed inside the cabin, hands trembling as she grabbed her father's old rifle. She had never shot a man before, but for Sarah, she would do what needed doing. Just as she was throwing supplies into a saddlebag, thundering hooves approached again. Grace spun around, rifle raised, only to find herself aiming at a tall stranger astride a chestnut stallion. "Whoa there, miss," he called, raising his hand slowly. "I mean no harm." "Who are you?" Grace demanded, the rifle unwavering despite her racing heart. The stranger tipped back his worn Stetson, revealing piercing blue eyes set in a sun-weathered face. "Samuel Vance, madam. Town marshal from Silver Creek." He nodded toward the horizon. "I've been tracking the Blackwell Gang for 3 days. Saw what happened from the ridge." Grace lowered the rifle slightly. "They took my sister." Samuel Vance dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the dirt. "I know, and I aim to help you get her back." His expression hardened as he looked in the direction the gang had fled. "By my reckoning, they're heading for Snake River. They've got a hideout near there." His eyes met Grace's with steely determination. "We'll find her before they reach the river." Grace's voice cracked. "I don't need your charity, Marshal. Sarah's my responsibility." Samuel's expression softened slightly. "This isn't charity, Miss Newman. Those men have prices on their heads and I aim to collect. But more than that." He paused, something haunted flickering across his face. "Let's just say I've got personal business with John Blackwell." Grace studied the marshal. He stood tall, at least 6 feet, lean but strong, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. His dark brown hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and a thin scar ran along his jawline. But it was his eyes that held her attention, blue as a summer sky but hard as steel when he spoke Blackwell's name. "How do you know who I am?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "Small territory, Miss Newman. Word gets around about 2 sisters running a homestead on their own." His lips curved into a small smile. "Especially when one of them can drive a harder bargain than most men at the trading post." Despite everything, Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Fine," she said finally. "But we leave now. Every minute counts." Samuel nodded. "Pack light. We'll need to move fast." Within 15 minutes, they were riding hard across the plains, Samuel on his chestnut stallion and Grace on her gray mare. The marshal led them on a route that cut across country rather than following the main trail. "The Blackwells will expect pursuit to come along the road," he explained as they paused briefly to water the horses at a small creek. "They've got 6 men. John Blackwell, his brothers Ezra and Thomas, and 3 hired guns, mean fellows named Hawkins, Cooper, and a Mexican they call El Cuchillo." "The knife," Grace translated, her stomach knotting with fear for Sarah. Samuel nodded grimly. "He didn't earn that name by being gentle." Seeing the horror on Grace's face, he added quickly, "But they won't harm your sister yet. They took her as leverage to force you to sell your land." "How can you be so sure?" Grace demanded. Samuel's expression darkened. "Because that's their method. They did the same to the Hargrove family over in Eagle Pass last year." He didn't elaborate further, but Grace could see from his face that the story didn't have a happy ending. They rode in silence for a while, pushing their horses as much as they dared. As the sun began to set, Samuel led them into a small copse of trees. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said. "Can't risk running the horses into the ground, and we won't do your sister any good if we're falling from our saddles." Grace wanted to protest, but exhaustion was already pulling at her limbs. She slid from her mare, wincing at the stiffness in her legs. "How much further?" "If they keep to their usual pace, we should catch them by tomorrow afternoon before they reach Snake River." Samuel unsaddled the horses efficiently. "They'll be confident, thinking they've got a good lead. That'll make them sloppy." As Samuel built a small, nearly smokeless fire, Grace pulled dried beef and hardtack from her saddlebags. They ate in silence, the gravity of their mission hanging heavy between them. "You should get some sleep," Samuel said finally. "I'll take first watch." Grace shook her head. "I won't be able to sleep, not with Sarah out there." Samuel's eyes softened. "You'll need your strength tomorrow, Miss Newman. When we find your sister, you'll need every ounce of it." Something in his tone made Grace look at him more closely. "This isn't just about bounties for you, is it? What did you mean by personal business with Blackwell?" Samuel stared into the fire, the flames casting shadows across his face. For a long moment, Grace thought he wouldn't answer. "3 years ago," he began, his voice low, "I was deputy marshal in a town called Willow Creek. Had a wife named Rebecca. We were expecting our first child." His jaw tightened. "Blackwell and his gang came through, robbed the bank. Rebecca was there making a deposit." He paused, swallowing hard. "She recognized John Blackwell from a wanted poster in my office. He shot her to keep her quiet." "I'm sorry," Grace whispered, understanding now the steel behind his eyes. Samuel nodded once sharply. "Get some rest, Miss Newman. I'll wake you in 4 hours." Despite her protests, exhaustion claimed Grace quickly. She dreamed of Sarah, of hands reaching out of darkness to drag her sister away while Grace stood frozen, unable to move or scream. She woke with a start to find Samuel crouched beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Easy," he murmured. "Just a dream." Grace sat up, disoriented for a moment before reality came crashing back. "Sarah still on their trail," Samuel assured her, "but it's your turn to watch while I get some shut-eye." Grace nodded, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "I can do that." Samuel handed her his revolver. "Just in case, though I don't expect trouble." As Samuel settled onto his bedroll, Grace moved to sit by the dying fire. The night was quiet except for the occasional hoot of an owl and the soft nickering of the horses. She studied the marshal's profile in the faint glow of the embers. Despite the hardness in him, there was something about Samuel Vance that made Grace feel safer than she had in years. Perhaps it was his competence, or the quiet confidence he exuded. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that he understood loss as intimately as she did. The night passed slowly. Grace watched the stars wheel overhead, praying that Sarah was unharmed, that they would find her before the worst could happen. When the sky began to lighten in the east, she gently woke Samuel. They were back in their saddles before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Samuel set a punishing pace, but Grace matched him stride for stride. By mid-morning they crested a ridge and Samuel raised a hand, signaling for Grace to halt. He dismounted and pulled out a battered brass spyglass, scanning the valley below. "There," he said quietly, handing the spyglass to Grace. "By that outcropping of rocks." Grace peered through the lens, her heart leaping when she spotted the Blackwell Gang's camp. She could make out 6 men moving about and a smaller figure sitting apart from them, hands bound behind her back. "Sarah," she breathed. "They've stopped to rest the horses," Samuel observed, taking back the spyglass. "Overconfident like I thought. They're not expecting anyone to have caught up with them yet." "What's the plan?" Grace asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Samuel studied the layout of the camp. "They've got your sister tied up, but she's alive and appears unharmed. That's good." He pointed to a cluster of boulders about 50 yards from the camp. "We'll approach from the east, using those rocks as cover. I'll create a distraction, draw their attention. You circle around and get to your sister." Grace nodded, heart pounding. And then we fight our way out if necessary." Samuel's hand rested on his revolver. "Can you shoot, Miss Newman?" "My father taught me. I'm not a sharpshooter, but I can hit what I aim at." "Good." Samuel handed her his Winchester repeating rifle. "You might need this." They left the horses secured in a stand of trees and made their way carefully down the slope, keeping to whatever cover they could find. As they drew closer, they could hear the men's voices carrying on the still air. "Waste of time, John," one was saying. "The girl ain't gonna sell just 'cause we took her sister." "She'll sell," came the confident reply. "They all sell in the end, or die stubborn. Either way, we get what we want." Grace's blood ran cold at the casual cruelty in the man's voice. Samuel touched her arm lightly, a silent reminder to stay focused. They reached the boulders without being detected. From this position, Grace could see Sarah clearly. Her sister sat on the ground, her blonde hair tangled around her face, but she was alert, her posture defiant despite the ropes binding her wrists. Pride swelled in Grace's heart. Her sister was scared, but not broken. "Remember," Samuel whispered, "when the shooting starts, you go straight for Sarah. Don't stop for anything. Get her untied and take cover. I'll handle the Blackwells." Grace nodded, clutching the rifle. "Be careful," she whispered back. Something flickered in Samuel's eyes. "You too, Grace." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sent an unexpected warmth through her despite the danger. Samuel checked his revolver one last time, then gave Grace a nod before slipping away to circle to the opposite side of the camp. Grace counted silently, giving him time to get into position, her heart hammering against her ribs. The first shot rang out, followed by Samuel's voice bellowing, "Blackwell, Marshal Vance from Silver Creek. Surrender now." Chaos erupted in the camp. Men scrambled for weapons, shouting in confusion. Grace spotted John Blackwell, a barrel-chested man with a thick beard, barking orders as he drew his revolver. One of the gang members fell, clutching his shoulder where Samuel's bullet had found its mark. Grace seized her moment. She sprinted from behind the boulders, keeping low, eyes fixed on Sarah. Her sister had jerked upright at the commotion, head swiveling toward the sound of gunfire. When she spotted Grace running toward her, Sarah's eyes widened in shock and hope. "Get down!" Grace shouted as she reached her sister, diving to the ground beside her as bullets whizzed overhead. With trembling hands, she worked at the knots binding Sarah's wrists. "Grace," Sarah gasped. "How did you know time?" Grace cut her off, finally freeing the ropes. "We need to move. Now." She pulled Sarah toward the nearest cover, an overturned wagon the gang had been using as part of their camp. More gunshots echoed across the valley as Samuel exchanged fire with the Outlaws. Peering around the edge of the wagon, Grace saw Samuel pinned down behind a rock outcropping, 3 of the gang members closing in on his position while the others provided covering fire. Without hesitation, Grace raised the Winchester, steadied her breathing as her father had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The shot caught one of the men, Ezra Blackwell, she would later learn, in the leg. He went down with a howl of pain. The distraction was enough for Samuel to take out another of his attackers with a well-placed shot. "Grace, look out!" Sarah cried. Grace whirled to find one of the outlaws, a thin-faced man with a scar across his cheek approaching from behind the wagon, revolver leveled at her chest. "Drop the gun, lady," he snarled, "or I put a hole in that pretty face." Grace froze, the Winchester still clutched in her hands. She calculated her chances of raising it in time slim to none. The decision was taken from her when Sarah, with a courage Grace hadn't known her sister possessed, hurled a rock at the outlaw's head. It wasn't enough to hurt him badly, but the surprise made him flinch, his shot going wide as Grace dove to the side. In the split second of confusion, Samuel appeared seemingly from nowhere, tackling the outlaw to the ground. They struggled briefly before Samuel delivered a knockout blow with the butt of his revolver. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, eyes scanning Grace for injuries. "No, we're fine," Grace assured him, pulling Sarah close. "How many are left?" "2 down, 1 unconscious," Samuel tallied. "That leaves 3, including John Blackwell." His expression darkened, "and they're regrouping." Indeed, the remaining outlaws had fallen back to a defensive position behind some rocks, shouting to each other. John Blackwell's voice rose above the others. "Vance, I know that's you. Still sore about your wife, are you?" Samuel's jaw clenched, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he guided Grace and Sarah to better cover behind a large boulder. "We're outnumbered, but we've got surprise on our side," he said. "They didn't expect a fight, and half their men are already down." He handed Sarah the unconscious outlaw's revolver. "You know how to use this." Sarah nodded, her hand steadier than Grace would have expected. "Pa taught us both." A bullet ricocheted off the boulder, sending stone fragments flying. Grace ducked instinctively, shielding Sarah. "They're trying to flank us," Samuel observed grimly. "We can't stay here." He peered around the edge of the boulder, then pulled back as another shot rang out. "There's a ravine about 30 yards to our right. If we can make it there, we'll have better cover and a path back to the horses." "How do we get there without getting shot?" Grace asked. Samuel considered for a moment. "I'll lay down covering fire. You two make a run for it. Once you're safe, give me a signal and I'll follow." Grace shook her head. "No, we go together or not at all." Samuel looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Grace's expression stopped him. "All right," he conceded. "Together." The decision was made for them when a shout from the outlaw's position was followed by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. "They're making a break for it," Samuel realized, peering around the boulder. "They're heading for the horses." Sure enough, the remaining Blackwell Gang members were mounting up, including John Blackwell himself. But rather than fleeing, they were circling to charge the boulder where Grace, Sarah, and Samuel had taken cover. "Run!" Samuel shouted, grabbing Grace's arm. "To the ravine, now!" They sprinted across the open ground, bullets kicking up dust at their heels. Samuel fired back as they ran, forcing the mounted outlaws to veer off their direct approach. They reached the edge of the ravine just as John Blackwell and his remaining men circled for another charge. "Down there," Samuel directed, helping the women navigate the steep slope into the ravine. The walls rose 8 feet on either side, offering protection from gunfire but also potentially trapping them. "What now?" Sarah gasped, trembling from exertion and fear. Samuel pointed down the ravine. "It runs east for about a 1/4 mile, then opens up near where we left the horses. If we can reach them before Blackwell figures out where we're headed." They hurried along the ravine, the sounds of confused shouting echoing from above as the outlaws temporarily lost sight of their quarry. The going was rough. The floor of the ravine was strewn with loose rocks and the occasional patch of stubborn vegetation. Sarah stumbled, crying out as her ankle twisted beneath her. Grace caught her sister before she could fall. "I've got you," she murmured, slipping an arm around Sarah's waist for support. We need to move faster, Samuel urged, glancing back over his shoulder. They'll figure out where we've gone any minute now. As if on cue, a shout from behind them confirmed their fears. They're in the ravine. Head 'em off at the eastern end, Samuel cursed under his breath. Change of plan. They'll be waiting for us at the exit. He scanned the walls of the ravine, spotting a place where erosion had created a series of rough ledges. There, we can climb out here and double back to the horses. Grace looked dubiously at the climb, then at Sarah's pained expression. Sarah's hurt. She can't make that climb. I can, Sarah insisted, though her pale face betrayed her pain. Samuel made a quick decision. I'll help her. You go first, Grace. I'll boost Sarah up, then you can help pull her the rest of the way. Grace nodded and began to climb. The handholds were precarious, but she made steady progress. When she reached the top, she lay flat on her stomach, extending her arms down toward Sarah. Samuel had lifted Sarah as high as he could, allowing her to grab onto the lowest ledge. With Grace pulling from above and Samuel pushing from below, they managed to get Sarah over the edge despite her injured ankle. Your turn, Marshal, Grace called down. Samuel had just grabbed the first handhold when the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the ravine. Go, he shouted up at them. Get to the horses. I'll hold them off. We're not leaving you, Grace replied fiercely. But Samuel had already dropped back to the ravine floor, drawing his revolver as the first of the outlaws rounded the bend. He fired twice in rapid succession, forcing the rider to rein in sharply. Samuel, Grace called desperately. He looked up at her, their eyes meeting for one charged moment. Get your sister to safety, Grace, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Please. Something passed between them in that look, a promise, perhaps, or an understanding. Grace swallowed hard and nodded. We'll get help, she promised. With Sarah leaning heavily on her, Grace made her way across the scrubby plateau toward the stand of trees where they'd left the horses. Behind them, gunfire echoed from the ravine. Each shot made Grace flinch, wondering if it was Samuel firing or being fired upon. They reached the horses to find them nervous but still secured. Grace helped Sarah into the saddle of the gray mare, then mounted the chestnut stallion herself. We need to go back for him, Sarah insisted, her face pale with pain but determined. Grace was torn. Everything in her wanted to ride back to help Samuel, but she couldn't risk Sarah's safety again. Before she could decide, the sound of a single horse approaching at a gallop drew her attention. She raised the Winchester, prepared to defend her sister, then nearly sobbed with relief when she recognized the rider. Samuel Vance rode hard toward them, his hat gone, a bloody gash across his forehead but very much alive. Ride, he shouted as he approached. They're right behind me. They spurred their horses eastward, away from the ravine and the remaining Blackwell Gang members. Samuel pulled alongside Grace. John Blackwell, she asked. Samuel's expression was grim. Still alive, he and one other. The rest won't be troubling anyone anymore. They pushed the horses as hard as they dared, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers. When they reached a small stream, Samuel called a halt to let the horses drink and to check Sarah's injured ankle. It's not broken, he pronounced after a careful examination. A bad sprain, but it should heal clean with rest. Sarah nodded gratefully, then looked between Samuel and her sister. How did you find me so quickly, I thought. Her voice broke slightly. I thought no one would come in time. Your sister was ready to take on the whole Blackwell gang single-handed, Samuel said with a hint of admiration. I just happened to arrive at the right moment to offer my help. And thank God you did, Grace said softly. She met Samuel's gaze. Thank you. Something changed in Samuel's expression, a softening around the eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. We're not safe yet, he reminded them. though his voice had lost some of its hard edge. "We need to keep moving." They rode through the afternoon, following game trails and creek beds to mask their trail. Samuel proved himself an expert tracker, frequently checking behind them for signs of pursuit. "I think we've lost them for now," he finally announced as the sun began to set. "But Blackwell won't give up easily. We need to find somewhere defensible to spend the night." He led them to a small canyon where a natural spring bubbled from the rocks. The entrance was narrow, easily defendable, and there was grass for the horses and water for all. As Grace helped Sarah dismount, she noticed her sister's face was flushed. "You're burning up," she said with concern, feeling Sarah's forehead. Samuel frowned, helping Grace guide Sarah to a comfortable spot against the canyon wall. The strain of the day might have brought on a fever. "Let me check that ankle again." When he unwrapped the makeshift bandage he'd applied earlier, Grace gasped. The ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, with angry red streaks extending upward. "Infection," Samuel said grimly. "She must have cut it when she fell." Fear clutched at Grace's heart. Out here in the wilderness, with the Blackwell Gang still hunting them, an infection could be as deadly as a bullet. "What can we do?" she asked, trying to keep panic from her voice. Samuel thought for a moment. "There's a small settlement about 10 miles northeast of here. Might be a doctor there, or at least someone with medicines." 10 miles, Grace looked at Sarah worriedly. "Can she make it that far?" "I'll be fine," Sarah insisted, though her eyes were bright with fever. Samuel shook his head. "She shouldn't be moved unless absolutely necessary." He made a decision. "I'll go at first light. You two will stay here where it's defensible." "And leave us unprotected," Grace challenged. "You have the Winchester and your sister has the revolver," Samuel reminded her. "The canyon walls will do the rest. One person with a rifle could hold off an army from that entrance." Grace wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Sarah needed medicine, and soon. As night fell, they built a small, sheltered fire. Samuel showed Grace how to make a poultice from certain plants to help draw out the infection, then taught her the signals he used as a marshal: 3 shots in rapid succession as a call for help, 2 shots with a pause, and then a third as an all clear. Sarah drifted into a fitful sleep while Grace and Samuel kept watch by the fire. "Tell me about her," Samuel said quietly, nodding toward Sarah. "She has your courage." Grace smiled fondly at her sleeping sister. "She's always been the stubborn one. When our parents died, I thought I'd have to be strong for both of us. But Sarah—" She shook her head in admiration. "She never broke, not once." "That runs in the family, I'd say," Samuel observed, his eyes on Grace. Grace felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "What about you? You mentioned your wife, but is there other family?" Samuel stared into the fire. "Had a brother once, lost him in the war. Parents passed when I was young, after Rebecca." He trailed off, then finished quietly, "Been on my own a long while." "Is that why you became a marshal?" "To hunt men like Blackwell," Samuel considered the question. "Partly. But I also believe in the law and justice. Someone has to stand for those things, especially out here where civilization is still taking root." He looked at Grace directly. "What about you? What keeps you on that homestead when it would be easier to sell and move to town?" "It's our home," Grace said simply. "Our parents built it from nothing. They're buried on that land. And," she glanced at Sarah, "it's all we have left of them." Samuel nodded in understanding. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. "You should get some sleep," Samuel eventually said. "I'll take first watch." "I'm not sure I can sleep," Grace admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them taking Sarah again." Samuel moved closer, his shoulder nearly touching hers. "She's safe now. You both are." The simple statement, delivered with such quiet confidence, eased something in Grace's chest. She found herself leaning slightly against Samuel's solid presence. "What will you do?" she asked. "After we get back, will you keep hunting Blackwell?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "Until he's brought to justice one way or another." "And then," Grace pressed gently, Samuel looked surprised, as if he hadn't considered there might be an after to his vendetta. "I don't know," he admitted. "Haven't thought that far ahead in a long time." Grace nodded, understanding. Since her parents' deaths, she too had lived day to day, focused only on survival. The future had seemed an impossible luxury. As the fire burned down to embers, exhaustion finally overtook Grace. She drifted to sleep with the solid warmth of Samuel beside her, his presence a bulwark against the night. She woke to gray dawn light and Sarah's worsening condition. Her sister's fever had spiked during the night, and she was now alternating between chills and sweats. "I need to go now," Samuel said, checking his revolver and rifle. "The sooner I get back with medicine, the better." Grace nodded, fear for Sarah overriding her concern about being left alone. "Be careful," she said, impulsively catching his hand. Samuel's fingers tightened around hers. "I will. Remember, 3 shots means trouble. Keep the fire small and stay back from the entrance." With one last lingering look, he mounted his chestnut stallion and rode out of the canyon, soon disappearing among the trees. The morning passed agonizingly slowly. Grace tended to Sarah, bathing her forehead with cool water from the spring and trying to coax her to drink. By midday, Sarah was delirious, talking to people who weren't there. "Pa," she murmured, eyes unfocused. "Is that you, Pa?" "It's Grace," she corrected gently, fighting back tears. "Samuel's gone to get medicine. You're going to be fine." Sarah's eyes cleared briefly. "He's a good man," she whispered. "The way he looks at you." Before Grace could ask what she meant, Sarah had slipped back into fevered dreams. The afternoon shadows were lengthening when Grace heard the sound she'd been dreading approaching: horses. More than one. She grabbed the Winchester and moved to the canyon entrance, positioning herself behind a large boulder that gave her cover while allowing her to see anyone approaching. 2 riders appeared at the edge of the trees. Grace's heart sank when she recognized John Blackwell's burly form. Beside him rode a thin Mexican man, El Cuchillo, she presumed. They were following Samuel's trail, moving slowly and carefully. Grace steadied the rifle, taking aim. She could pick one of them off from this distance, but not both before they took cover. And then they would know exactly where she and Sarah were hiding. She held her fire, watching as they dismounted and examined the ground. Blackwell pointed toward the canyon, saying something to his companion. They were going to find the entrance. It was only a matter of time. Grace's mind raced. She needed to draw them away from Sarah. Making a quick decision, she fired a single shot into the air, then sprinted across the canyon to exit through a narrow cleft in the far wall that Samuel had shown her an emergency escape route. As she'd hoped, Blackwell and El Cuchillo turned toward the sound of the shot. Grace worked her way around the side of the canyon, staying hidden in the trees until she had circled behind the Outlaws. "She's alone," she heard Blackwell say. "Vance must have left her. Check the canyon, I'll circle around." Grace moved deeper into the forest, deliberately leaving visible tracks. She needed to lead them away from Sarah, to buy time until Samuel returned. She fired another shot, making sure it was away from the direction of the canyon. The strategy worked. Soon she heard both men crashing through the undergrowth, following her trail. She kept moving, using every trick her father had taught her about woodcraft to stay just ahead of her pursuers. But as the sun sank lower, Grace realized she had a new problem. In her haste to lead the Outlaws away, she had lost her own bearings. The forest looked the same in every direction, and the growing darkness only made navigation harder. A branch snapped behind her. Grace whirled, raising the Winchester, but the forest was still. She backed away slowly, then turned to continue her retreat and found herself face to face with El Cuchillo. The Mexican outlaw smiled, his teeth gleaming white in his dark face. "Señorita," he said, drawing a wicked-looking knife from his belt, "you have led us a merry chase." Grace fired without hesitation, but in her panic, the shot went wide. Before she could chamber another round, El Cuchillo lunged forward, knocking the rifle from her hands. Grace fell backward, scrambling away on hands and knees as the outlaw advanced, knife raised. A shot rang out. El Cuchillo jerked, a look of surprise crossing his face before he crumpled to the ground. Samuel Vance stepped out from between the trees, his revolver still smoking. "Grace," he called, rushing to her side. "Are you hurt?" "No," she gasped, letting him pull her to her feet. "But Blackwell, he's close by. And Sarah's safe," Samuel assured her. "I got back to the canyon and found her alone. The doctor from the settlement came with me. He's tending to her now." Relief flooded through Grace, making her knees weak. Samuel caught her as she sagged, his arms strong and steady around her. "How did you find me?" she asked, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "Followed the gunshots," Samuel said with a hint of a smile. "Though I have to say, leading two killers on a chase through the forest wasn't exactly what I meant by stay where it's defensible." Grace managed a shaky laugh. "They were going to find the canyon. I couldn't let them get to Sarah." Samuel's expression sobered. "You're either the bravest or the most foolhardy woman I've ever met, Grace Newman." Before she could respond, a shout from nearby reminded them of the remaining threat. "Cuchillo, you find her!" John Blackwell's voice boomed through the trees. Samuel pushed Grace behind him, raising his revolver. "Stay down," he whispered. Blackwell emerged from the trees, his own gun drawn. He spotted El Cuchillo's body first, then looked up to find Samuel waiting for him. "Vance," he spat, recognition and hatred darkening his features. "Should have known you'd turn up like a bad penny." "It's over, Blackwell," Samuel said evenly. "Your gang is finished. Throw down your gun." Blackwell laughed, an ugly sound. "You've been chasing me for 3 years, Marshal. You think I'm going to surrender now?" "I think you're out of options," Samuel replied. "Your brothers are dead. Your hired guns are dead or captured. It's just you now." Something dangerous flashed in Blackwell's eyes. "Maybe, but I can still take you with me." His gaze shifted to where Grace crouched behind Samuel. "And the girl, too. Finish what I started with your pretty wife." Samuel's expression hardened. "You can try." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Blackwell raised his gun with lightning speed, but Samuel was faster. 2 shots cracked in rapid succession. Blackwell staggered, looking down in surprise at the spreading red stain on his chest. "Rebecca," Samuel said quietly as Blackwell fell to his knees. "Her name was Rebecca." Blackwell tried to speak, blood bubbling at his lips, but no words came. He toppled forward, face down in the forest loam. Samuel stood motionless, staring down at the body of the man he'd hunted for 3 years. Grace rose slowly and moved to his side, gently placing her hand on his arm. "It's done," she said softly. Samuel took a deep breath, then holstered his revolver. "Yes," he agreed, his voice rough. "It's done." They made their way back to the canyon, where they found Sarah awake and much improved under the care of Dr. Wilson, a gruff older man who had accompanied Samuel from the settlement. "The medicine's taking hold," the doctor informed them. "The fever's broken. With rest and care, she'll make a full recovery." Sarah smiled weakly at Grace. "I knew you'd come back," she said, squeezing her sister's hand. Her gaze moved to Samuel. "Both of you." The next few days passed in a blur of recovery and explanations. A patrol of territorial lawmen, alerted by Samuel before he'd left the settlement, arrived to collect the bodies of the Blackwell Gang and escort the survivors safely back to White Rock Valley. Grace and Sarah's homestead stood untouched, just as they had left it. As the sisters settled back into their home, with Sarah confined to bed rest by doctor's orders, Grace found herself watching for Samuel whenever she worked outside. He had ridden with the lawmen to Silver Creek to file his official report, promising to return soon. A week passed, then another. Sarah recovered enough to move about the cabin with the aid of a crutch, teasing Grace about her frequent glances toward the road. "He'll come back," Sarah assured her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Who?" Grace asked, feigning ignorance. Sarah rolled her eyes. "Marshal Vance, of course. The man's sweet on you, Grace, blind as a bat not to see it." Grace felt her cheeks warm. He had his vengeance, that's what he wanted all along. "Maybe at first," Sarah conceded, "but things change, people change." She gave her sister a knowing look. "I saw how he looked at you, like you were the sunrise after a long, dark night." Before Grace could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider appeared on the road, silhouetted against the setting sun. Grace's heart quickened as she recognized the broad-shouldered figure atop the chestnut stallion. Samuel Vance rode up to the porch, looking somehow different than when he'd left. It took Grace a moment to realize what it was. The hard lines of his face had softened, the ever-present tension in his shoulders eased. He looked like a man who had laid down a heavy burden. "Evening, ladies," he greeted them, removing his hat as he dismounted. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Marshal," Sarah said, shooting Grace a meaningful glance as she struggled to her feet. "In fact, I was just heading inside to rest my ankle. Grace, why don't you keep the Marshal company while I make us some coffee?" Before Grace could protest, Sarah had disappeared into the cabin, leaving her alone with Samuel on the porch. "How's the ankle?" Samuel asked, climbing the porch steps to stand beside Grace. "Healing well," Grace replied. "Thanks to you," Samuel shook his head. "I just fetched the doctor." "You're the one who kept her alive until help arrived." A comfortable silence fell between them as they both looked out over the Newman homestead. The fields were beginning to green with spring crops, and the setting sun bathed everything in golden light. "It's beautiful here," Samuel observed. "I can see why you fought so hard to keep it," Grace nodded. "It's home, though I have to admit it's been challenging for just the two of us to manage everything." Samuel cleared his throat. "About that, I've been doing some thinking since we parted." He turned to face Grace directly. "For 3 years, hunting Blackwell was all I lived for. I never thought about what would come after, never allowed myself to." Grace's heart began to beat faster. "And now I find myself thinking about the future again, about possibilities." Samuel's blue eyes held hers intently. "I resigned my marshal's position in Silver Creek." "You did?" Grace couldn't hide her surprise. "Why?" "Because I realized something when we were out there in the wilderness, fighting for our lives." Samuel took a step closer to her. "I realized that vengeance is a poor substitute for living. And that meeting you and your sister, seeing your courage, your determination to build something good in this harsh land, it reminded me of what I'd lost sight of." Grace found herself holding her breath. "Which is? That life isn't just about survival. It's about finding someone worth living for." Samuel reached out hesitantly, taking her hand in his. "I know it's sudden and you have every right to tell me I'm being presumptuous, but I couldn't stop thinking about you, Grace Newman, about your spirit, your bravery, your heart." Grace looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Samuel's face. The hardened lawman she'd first met was still there in the strength of his jaw, the steadiness of his gaze. But there was something new as well, a warmth, a hope that made her own heart lift in response. "What are you saying, Samuel?" she asked softly. I'm saying that I'd like to stay, to help you and Sarah with the homestead, to see if what I felt out there, what I believe you felt too, might grow into something more." His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "If you'll have me." For a moment, Grace couldn't speak past the emotion swelling in her throat. Then she smiled, turning her hand to lace her fingers with his. "Sarah did mention we could use a good hand around the place," she said, her voice warm with promise. "Someone who knows his way around horses and rifles." Samuel's answering smile lit his entire face. "I believe I qualify on both counts." "Then I suppose we could offer you a trial period," Grace teased gently, "to see how things develop." Samuel stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I've always been a quick study," he murmured. When he bent to kiss her, Grace met him halfway, her heart soaring with the certainty that this was not an ending but a beginning. Inside the cabin, Sarah watched through the window, a satisfied smile on her face. She had known from the moment she saw the marshal standing tall and determined on their porch, promising to find her before the outlaws reached the river, that he was exactly what her sister needed, a partner worthy of her strength and her heart. As spring blossomed into summer, Samuel Vance became an integral part of the Newman homestead. The cabin that had felt too quiet after their parents' passing now rang with conversation and occasional laughter. The fields flourished under shared labor, and for the first time in years, Grace found herself looking forward rather than merely struggling through each day. By harvest time, it surprised no one when Samuel and Grace announced their intention to marry. They exchanged vows beneath the old oak tree where the Newman parents were buried, Sarah standing proud as witness despite her still healing ankle. "You think they would have approved?" Grace asked Samuel later as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. Samuel's arm tightened around her waist. "A man who would ride through hell to bring their daughters home safely. I think they would have." Grace smiled, leaning into his embrace. "When I saw Sarah being taken that day, I thought my world was ending. I never imagined it would lead to this, to you." "Sometimes the darkest trails lead to the brightest clearings," Samuel said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'm just grateful mine led me to you." As the years passed, the Newman homestead grew and prospered. Sarah eventually married the doctor's son from the settlement, building a home of her own on adjacent land. Grace and Samuel welcomed 2 children, a son they named after Grace's father, and a daughter they called Rebecca, in memory of a love lost and the journey that had brought them together. Sometimes on quiet evenings, Grace would think back to that desperate moment when she had watched her sister being dragged away by outlaws, and a determined marshal had promised, "We'll find her before they reach the river." In that darkest hour, she could never have imagined the life that would bloom from such terrible beginnings. But that, she had learned, was the way of the West, harsh and unforgiving at times, but always offering the promise of new beginnings to those brave enough to claim them.